So this is Leslie Batchelder, and she is the cluster coordinator for popular culture. And she is also a scholar of popular culture. And I wanted to ask Leslie, what do you think? What do you think students who take popular culture courses should know or be able to do when they come out of their courses?
Well, it's a great question. I think that the study of popular culture should enable a student to be a much more um, savvy consumer of media, of mass media in
Mm-hmm.
particular, like films and comic books and, the whole array, blogs, social media stars that we have now, YouTube stars and things like that. I mean, or Vines or whatever, to be much more critically aware. And by critically, of course, we don't mean negative. We mean, have a depth of analysis of these products instead of just being sort of bombarded by them, to kind of say, well, wait a minute, what does this really mean? And what kind of representations are happening in pop culture? And what does that mean? And, it's fantastic in an election year. We have this great free-for-all going on in public discourse around the presidential campaign. And that's a great example of how certain issues come up like sexism or privilege and people of color, interrupting different candidates from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump and saying, hey, Black Lives Matter. It's like, well, why is that happening? And how is that dealt with in our media? And how do people think about that? And how do the images that we're fed create an atmosphere in which that's possible? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So that it's possible to think about women in a certain way as, not really good candidates because they're too cranky or, the other words that people use,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. It's like to get young people to really look at the media and say, wait a minute,
Mm-hmm.
what kind of images am I being fed and why? And who owns the rights to production of those images? And why aren't other images or other ideas being floated around?
Mm-hmm.
Why is it so outrageous? What some people might say, that Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, oh, this is outrageous. But if you actually look at our founding documents and stuff, it's not really that outrageous. And part
Mm-hmm.
of that is the media influence around different campaigns, or the fact that someone like Donald Trump can just go hog wild and make all sorts of comments.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, that hasn't been acceptable in our political discourse, and suddenly it is. So what is that about? So for students to really be able to think about what kind of cultural issues we have. Certainly, I mentioned Black Lives Matter, the whole issue of race in this country. We've gone through the civil rights movement, we had the Civil War, then we had the civil rights movement, and we think that we've dealt with it. But actually, we're still dealing with it every day, and we're still dealing with the repercussions of it. And speaking of race and racial politics in the media, we had this huge sort of crisis moment in the Academy Awards
Mm-hmm.
because people were saying, wait a minute, there's a few good black actors out there
Mm-hmm.
and directors and so on and so forth, and they never get recognized. And why is that? So, these kind of things weave in and out of the images that we see every day and the
Mm-hmm.
way that we understand popular culture. And so I want students to walk away saying, being more critical, sort of having agency
Mm-hmm.
over and against these images instead of just being a passive consumer and saying, oh, this is cute, this is funny. Like a good example of that is athletic gear. Like a lot of people say, oh, I love Nike products. But to think about the marketing that goes behind it and to
Mm-hmm.
think about the choices, and sure, they're great products, but are they really worth such and such money? And how are they made? How are they produced? And why do we have this fashion fetish around these shoes, these
Mm-hmm.
products, to be able to say, well, maybe I really don't need to consume all that
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And I think that most people do have some cynicism or some sort of critical thinking about media, but I think that as an educated person, you have to have that even more so. You have to
Mm-hmm.
be able to be aware of things that support dominant ideologies about who should be a leader or who should be in control or who has something valid to say even.
Mm-hmm.
And that plays out in the media, in the mass media.
So what I hear you saying is that people who study pop culture, we're looking at it both culture as artifacts of the culture, but we'll also look maybe at it historically.
Yeah.
That it's about asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
It's about looking at dynamics of power and influence.
Right.
It's about looking at consumption and the market and how the market influences media, and also how media and things like film, news, social media, how they influence both the way we see ourselves and the way we see each other.
Yeah, and not only that, but what you just mentioned, that list, film, media, news, there's a synergy that's never been there before. Like you can turn on the CBS News. When I was growing up, the news was the news. Now they're marketing products of their sister companies, like a film. Mm-hmm. Pearl Harbor, you saw it with Star Wars, you see it in the news itself, the nightly news. The three big national news sources that we have had traditionally, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Mm-hmm. They're actually marketing films now. So a film is no longer just an object to be understood as, oh, this is a film, let's study film now. But it's also this whole franchise of events around marketing the film that influence us. Because we see it, we go on Facebook, everywhere we go, we see advertisements
McDonald's.
For... And Star Wars, the recent Star Wars release was a great example of that. I mean, it was a media blitz. Mm-hmm. And you couldn't get away from it. Yeah. Even if you don't like Star Wars. I don't happen to love Star Wars. But I know, you should not say that. I don't happen to love it. But, I was inundated and I found it annoying, but I also found it interesting, all the connections, the synergy between the marketing component of it, and we're seeing that more and more and more. That's accelerating, not decreasing.
Yeah.
So those things aren't separate anymore.
So let me ask you the next question, which is, what do you see in terms of the relationship between the things you might learn in a pop culture course and social service and social change?
Well, one of the assignments that I used to do in my pop culture course all the time was it was a group project, and I would ask students, I would give them a list of alternative media sources. Like we have quite a few here in Portland, KBOO, whatever, a bunch of different alternative media sources. And I would say, I want you to investigate how they're doing something a little different than mass media. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I sort of see in terms of service work or thinking about how messages get out, I would see a student going out and visiting either an alternative media source, and there are many in Portland, or doing something like going somewhere where media is produced, like we have a really great zine place here in Portland where they have a whole center where you can go learn about making zines, you can make your own zine, and it's kind of like a working space for creating zines. Are
you talking about the independent?
Yeah, independent media
publishing
resource center. Yeah,
IPRC.
Yeah, and that I think would be a really interesting thing for a student to go out and work there, or do something there. I mean, I think that it's really important for students to think about how media is produced here. Or they could go to somewhere like, one of the small film places, or, and see what kind of work goes on there. So I would like them to investigate further what actually goes on in producing popular culture sources here in Portland. So that would be for me.
Yeah. I could see, too, a student thinking about how popular culture media influences the way we think about certain groups of people, and how that could influence social change. I mean, you mentioned a lot of examples when you were talking earlier about Black Lives Matter and how the media is dealing with the Academy Awards, and how we can use popular culture actually to think critically about social change.
Right.
And it definitely influences social change.
Right. And I think that it's interesting to see how the mainstream media deals with people who are trying to say, well, wait a minute, this narrative is... Mm-hmm. Who's written this narrative? Mm-hmm. Usually it's these big corporations, with massive marketing, tools behind them. And I think that it's interesting, to go work with social justice groups or groups that are involved with non-represented communities and say, well, how are you trying to get your message out there? I guess that's kind of what I mean by alternative media too. One of the things I like about places like KBOO, I'll just say again, the alternative radio station, is they're trying to get alternative messages out there about events. So like they might cover Black Lives Matter completely differently than the mainstream press, right? Because they might actually have Black people, for one thing, in there talking about, in our community, it goes down like this. Portland, did you know that Portland, the police bureau was taken into, not custody, but, was taken over, looked at very seriously by the federal government because of abuses against people of color and people with mental illness. And they found that that was true. Yeah. So they did a whole investigation. And so, they'll talk about those things and say, this is reality. And people try to say, oh, these Black people, they're just, all lives matter or whatever. And they don't really understand the history, going all the way back to slavery, but, the history of these people, and particularly in Portland. There's a very specific narrative about being Black in Portland. So I think that, I think there's a connection between social justice issues and alternative media and things like that. So I would see students working in that way.
Okay. So I'm going to